Hello again. So in your first video lecture for this week, I talked about the types of evidence that you might come across in your speeches or while you're researching your speeches and what you need to do to prove your empirical claims as true. Then in the second lesson for this week, I didn't have the video lecture, but I did give you a bunch of links that kind of showed you different types of sources that you could look up, how to evaluate sources, how to use Google Scholar, which is something incredibly important, and how to use Wikipedia to your advantage. And I do want to make two things clear. You will not be required to use a source that you find on Google Scholar for your informative speech, but you will be required to use a source found on Google Scholar for your persuasion speech. So it's really important to understand how to do that and how to search it. So please make sure you watch those videos, play around with Google Scholar, those kinds of things. And regarding the Wikipedia links, I don't want you to use information that you find on the Wikipedia page, but I do want you to utilize their reference tool all the way at the bottom of the screen. So if you find something that's interesting about Wikipedia and you click on like the reference link, I want you to cite the actual information, not the information that you find on Wikipedia. So while I'm asking you to use Wikipedia for your speeches, I'm not asking you to cite Wikipedia. So as you're giving your speeches, if you say something like, and according to Wikipedia in 2020, that would be incorrect. You have to cite the information that they cited. So go to the original source. So make sure that you're watching those videos and asking me any questions about Google Scholar or Wikipedia that you're confused about, because last semester when I assigned this, everyone used Wikipedia as a source. You're not supposed to use Wikipedia as a source, but you can use Wikipedia to help you find other sources. So for this third and final lesson of this week, I want to provide a video lecture that kind of gives you some examples of oral citations. Oral citations are very, very, very important. And like I've been saying on multiple texts here, in your English papers, you have a works cited or a reference page or a bibliography that kind of directs your readers to where you found the information. You give them the links, you give them the title of books, the page numbers, all of those things. You can't necessarily do that with a speech, meaning you wouldn't give your audience members a works cited or a reference page. We wouldn't go look those things up after your speech. We need to know in your speech, during your speech, the moment that you say it, that this information is both credible and current, which is something that you learned in that CRAP method. So you really want to make sure that all of the sources that you have in your speech pass the CRAP test, which you'll have an assignment for that this week. And then I'll be asking you to do the CRAP test for all of your sources moving forward. But you really want to make sure that your oral citations are accurate. So I want to provide you with some examples. I definitely want you to follow that link that I posted above this video lecture. And that kind of gives you a nice long, not long, but it is kind of long. It's a PDF, like a website, an Adobe site that kind of really explains oral citations and when you need dates and when you need author names and those kinds of things. But I'm going to briefly lay it all out here. So let me go ahead and share my screen so you can see this. All right, so in Game of Thrones, there's this wonderful scene where Daenerys Targaryen, after making her way to the realm and kind of conquering, spoiler alert, what she needed to do, she kind of gives this speech to all of her soldiers. And in it, she kind of explains where they're going and how she's going to do things as a queen. And while she doesn't necessarily cite any sources here, I thought this was kind of a nice little example of giving a speech. So I have to sneeze, I think. There we go. I knew it. So when you're citing sources in your speech, you have to say out loud where you got them, what makes them credible, those kinds of things. So while each source has a different type of oral citation, how you would cite a book in your speech is not how you would cite a New York Times article, which is not how you'd cite a YouTube video, which is nowhere near how you would cite an episode from your favorite TV show. All of it's different. And that Adobe website kind of explains how they're different. And you can obviously email me any questions that you have regarding a particular source. But I want to go over what I call the three-eyed raven, and then give you an example of some of the more common types of oral citations. So how should you cite your sources in your speech? Well, in Game of Thrones, there's this kind of minimal plot line that is really involved in, I think it's like season 4 or season 5, and then goes absolutely nowhere, but it's the three-eyed raven. And in the show, the three-eyed raven is this raven that kind of sees all, the past, the present, and the future. And the reason why I use the three-eyed raven for sources is not only do we talk about Game of Thrones when I use evaluating citations or sources, but there's 3 things every citation needs to confirm or needs to have before it makes it into your speech. So I want you to remember for all of your sources, the three-eyed raven. First, every source that you provide in your speech needs some sort of identifier. Maybe that's the name of an author. Maybe that's just the title of the article. But you need to tell me what this is or who this is. Then every source needs a date. Some sources might need the full day, month, year. Other sources might just need the year, but every source needs the year. This is the only way to prove to your audience that you're providing current, recent sources. So everything that you say in your speech that has a source attached to it needs to have a year. If you do not cite the year, your citation is inaccurate. It's going to sound like you just made it up. And then every source needs to have a credibility statement if it needs it. What I mean by that is if you're providing a citation from an unfamiliar source, you need to explain to your audience why we should trust that source. If your source is pretty influential or well-known, you don't need to establish the credibility of that source. For example, if we're giving a speech about horror tropes or common themes in horror stories, maybe we're citing Stephen King. According to Stephen King, tropes in the horror series are plentiful. I wouldn't have to provide a credibility statement for who Stephen King is, at least not here in the United States. We know that Stephen King is a popular horror author. He's a New York Times bestseller. Almost all of his books have been turned into horror movies. So we wouldn't need to say, according to Stephen King, a popular, successful American horror author, tropes in horror stories are plentiful. We wouldn't need to establish the credibility there. But if this was an unknown author, Bill Lucio, who the heck is Bill Lucio? What horror books has he written? I might have to establish the credibility there. And according to Bill Lucio, a self-explained expert on all things Halloween, tropes in the horror series are plentiful. So if it's an unfamiliar source, an unfamiliar person, you're going to want to tell your audience why we should believe them. Who is this person? Why does their information make sense? Okay, I'll tell you right now, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, all of these common news sources are pretty influential. We don't really need to establish the credibility there. But if you're giving a speech to a non-Harper audience and you cite the Harbinger, which is our school newspaper, you might have to say a newspaper written by staff and students of Harper Community College, you know, if it's a non-Harper Community College audience. So kind of evaluating who your audience is and what they already know about this and who your sources are where your sources are coming from. You may or may not need a credibility statement, but you should constantly be thinking about that. But every source needs an identifier and a year. The credibility statement as needed. All right, so some of the more common examples are books, articles from like a news source, articles from an academic journal or scholarly article, and then what else am I going to go over here? A website, something that you might find from a website. So let's say that you are citing a news source. So this is information from a periodical, something that is published periodically, multiple times a day, multiple times a week, multiple times a month. This is going to be something like your New York Times, your BBC, your Chicago Tribune, your Harbinger, your NPR, all of these like major news outlets that are both electronic or written. So for this, what you need to cite is the title of the news source, not the title of the article. So where did you get this? The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Red Eye, like where is this coming from? So what's the title of the news source, not the title of the article? I need the full publication date, so the day, the month, and the year that this article came out. And that's because popular news sources are published hourly, minutely, daily, monthly, annually. Like these are just every day the New York Times has a series of top stories. So this is not something that's just published once a year. This is something that's published every hour. It's refreshed. So that's why you need the full day, the month, and the year. And then always you need the credibility if needed. So here's an example of a news source. As stated in the September 22nd, 2019 Westeros Weekly. Do you know what the Westeros Weekly is? I don't know. So let me tell you right here. A weekly publication of all goings on in Westeros. Winter is coming. So notice how I put the citation before I put the information. You always want to cite the source first, then tell me what you're citing. You wouldn't want to go, winter is coming, according to blah, blah, blah. It's always got to go before, because you want to tell your audience, hey, I'm about to tell you something important, and here's where it came from. So you notice I've got the full date, month, day, year, where it came from, the title of the news source, not the title of the article, and the credibility statement as needed. You can move these things around and say it however you want. According to Westeros Weekly, a weekly publication of all goings on in Westeros, they stated in their September 22nd, 2019 article that winter is coming. So how you say that information doesn't really matter to me, but you got to hit those three criteria, the three-eyed raven: identifier, date, credibility. All right, so that's how you'd cite a news source or a periodically published news document. What if you're citing a book? Books are a little bit different. So when you're citing a book, you need the author, always, who wrote the book, and you need the credibility of that author if needed. You know, you wouldn't need to establish the credibility of Stephen King, but you might need to establish the credibility of, you know, Joe Schmuck, who just wrote their first book. Then you need the full title of the book, and you need the year of the publication. You do not need the publisher, like Penguin Publishing. You do not need the location, like this was published in New York. You don't need any of that. Who's the author? Why do they matter? Title of the book, year that the book was published, okay? So here's an example. In his 2018 memoir, I Drink and I Know Things, Hand of the King, an avid wine enthusiast, Tyrion Lannister discusses the various vineyards throughout King's Landing. All right, so in 2018, there's my date. I Drink and I Know Things, there's my title. Tyrion Lannister, there's my author, and I'm telling you what makes him credible. Not only is he Hand of the King, but like vice president, but he's also a wine enthusiast. He knows a lot about wine. So it makes sense that in his book, he tells us about the vineyards located in where we live, King's Landing. So I'm establishing the credibility of my author by explaining his background, providing the date and the name of the book, okay? Maybe you're citing a journal article. Now this, if you go back to that video, the first YouTube video that I had you watch that talks about scholarly, trade, or popular, the popular articles are your news source. The first example that I gave you, the one about Westeros Weekly, that's your New York Times, Chicago Tribune, blah, 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 blah. Trade articles and academic journals or scholarly articles is what I mean when I'm saying journal. So when you're citing a journal, it's an academic or scholarly or trade article, something that you'd find on Google Scholar or a library database, not a People's Magazine or something like that, okay? So here you need the title of the journal, not the title of the article written inside of the journal. You need the year of publication. You don't need the full date because technically, usually, journal articles are published once a year or maybe twice a year. So they're a little easier to find. And then you don't really need a credibility statement, because if it's from a trade article, a trade journal, or an academic journal, that credibility, there's a rigorous publication process. You've already learned about that, but that credibility is assumed if it's coming from a journal. All right, so here's an example. The 2018 Journal of the Seven Realms details how only 2% of Westeros citizens own Valyrian steel. So this journal article came out in 2018. I don't need to know the title of the journal article, but I do need to know the title of the journal, which is the Journal of the Seven Realms. Okay, so that's your easiest citation. Only two things: year, journal, title. Okay. And then the last one I want to talk about is when you're citing a website or an organization. This might be something that doesn't have a periodical published, but they are an organization online, like maybe the World Wildlife Fund, the Human Rights Campaign, American Cancer Society is always a popular one, Harper College. These are examples of organizations that have websites, but not news publications. All right. So when you're finding information online from an organization and you want to use their website, this is how you would cite them. First, you need the title of the website or the name of the organization and the credibility as needed. So you wouldn't say, according to www.f.com, you would say, according to the World Wildlife Foundation's website. Okay, so tell me who the organization is, not the URL, and then establish the credibility if needed. And then the full publication date if possible. So we're going to go back to the day, the year, and the month. If you can only find the year, that's fine. Sometimes you need to look at the bottom of the website and it'll give you a copyright date. That means that everything published on this website has been refreshed. It's been fact-checked. It's been changed up to this date. If the page that you're looking at doesn't have a date attached to it, look at the bottom to see if there's a copyright date. That tells you that everything on the website is current according to that date. If you cannot find a date on the website, please shoot me the link in an email and I'll help you look for it. Okay, and this is an example of what that might sound like. According to a December 2018 report from the Night's Watch, if we do not band together to defend the wall, the White Walkers will destroy us all. So the Night's Watch is an organization. I got this information from their website. And then there's the date, always the citation before the information. C comes before I in the alphabet. So you cite before you inform. Okay. So that's really all I have for this one. I just wanted to give you some examples to show you how they might sound out loud in your speech. This is tough stuff. This is like the Pythagorean theorem of speech. All right, this is the most complicated, in my opinion, the most complicated thing you will learn in the entire class is how to orally cite your speeches. I'm kind of a stickler for this. So if I'm telling you, you need the name, you need a year, and you need a credibility, and you only give me a year, that citation is incorrect. You're going to lose points on your speech. So you really want to make sure that you're doing this correctly. Go through that oral citation Adobe Sparks website that I've published. I'm going to post these examples. I'm going to post on to, you'll see them in example, like an example citations thing in your speeches in here, probably in this folder. So you'll see all of this stuff. So use it to your advantage. Okay. If you have any questions about oral citations, if you have any questions about types of sources, and if you've got any questions about how to evaluate the sources that you find using Wikipedia, using Google Scholar, using the CRAP method, all of those things, please let me know. And yeah, enjoy your week, and I will see you next week for informative speaking. Bye.